There we go. Well, welcome, folks. That's our cue. The door's being shut, so we'll get underway with a session here this afternoon after lunch. So hopefully nobody's eating too much, got a coffee, and nobody's going to be getting that sleepy feeling. So a couple of reminders I just need to go over again on behalf of APEG. As it is for this afternoon. I think we all know where everything is. There's the beer and wine reception this afternoon. It's by the sponsors, Great West Life and Johnson. So not a lot more to mention from that side of things. Myself, my name is James Chandler. I'm the engineering manager with the City of Port Moody and work with our municipal engineers division. So thanks for coming today and sharing with us this session. I'd like to introduce Kim Stevens, who's going to talk and hopefully interact with us for the next hour about water sustainability. And I'll hand straight over to Kim, let him introduce himself a little bit more, talk about the presentation, and we'll get underway. So thank you.
Thank you, James. And as you said, I'm Kim Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Water Sustainability. Now, it would help me to know you a bit better, and I've already recognized Steve here, the Fraser Basin Council. So maybe just to kind of give me the first sense of who you are. Like, geographically, how many people are from the island here? How many from the Lower Mainland region? Most of the Lower Mainland. The rest of British Columbia. Whereabouts? Prince George. Kamloops. Okanagan. Okay. The next question. How many people actually work for local government? So, probably 20%. Okay. So the rest of you, consulting. Okay, 60%. Fraser Basin Council, obviously right here, but what other kind of groups are represented here? Like people who didn't put up their hands yet?
I'm from YVR.
YVR? Okay. And what brought you here today?
To
this session, yeah, water.
I work on the planning side of engineering, so not so much on the project management side, but just interested about the concept of asset management and potentially be applied to complex infrastructure.
Okay.
Piqued my interest.
Well, I'm glad you're here. And anybody else want to? Who else was not from municipal government or? Okay, that's the rest of you are shy, right? Okay, then I'll get right into it. So in terms of my title today, the theme, which is sustainable watershed systems through asset management, and I guess you're all members, so I was pleased that the APEGBC decided to feature our presentation and make it the cover story, giving us a chance to kind of give you a takeaway. So as long as you got your innovation magazine, you have your Cole's notes, or sort of. And in the tagline you see primer on application of ecosystem-based understanding. Well, that's a primer which we released last month in conjunction with the Union of BC Municipalities Annual Convention. So again, you know, the stuff that you can get off waterbucket.ca if you want to have a record of today, and hopefully I will inform and educate and maybe even inspire you. I like quotable quotes. I collect them, so if anybody generates a quotable quote today, I'll caption it, I'll probably use it. This is one of my favorite quotes, which is from Mike Harcourt, former premier, a long time ago. And you know, in terms of what he actually said, the significance of choices, and you know that's kind of a theme I think of in society in general today, which is the margins of safety from our engineering perspective are so tight that you know really if we get the choices wrong, you know the consequences can be quite significant, quite magnified. But conversely, let's be positive here. The glass is half full. You know we can get the choices right. So that's kind of the underlying theme of my presentation today, is we need to be getting the choices right because that's what pays off over time. I'll link it back to you know the overarching theme here, which is climate change adaptation. You know, it is about water, but it is also about the water-land connection. So career-wise, I'm a water guy, but I have to keep reminding people that it's not water, it's not land, it's land and water, because the consequences for water are the result of what we do on the land. So it's your land ethic that drives the impacts on water. Can you see okay from the Icelandic? Good, great. And really, what are we trying to create is those water resilient cities over time. That's why I said get the choices right. So in terms of today, I'm gonna you'll leave today with 3 big ideas. And this is the first big idea I'm going to leave you with, which is Daniel Pauly's shifting baseline syndrome. How many in the room have even heard of that expression before? I have a feeling you might have. No? No? Who has? You've heard it? Okay, so we're learning something new today. Well, Daniel Pauly, even though he's from France, he's actually a UBC prof. So he's has global renown, so to speak. And it was in 1995 that he actually coined the phrase shifting baseline syndrome. And if you talk to Daniel, or if you watch his TED Talk, it all happened by happenstance because at the last minute after a conference, the person who was supposed to write up the introduction to the proceedings didn't do it, and he stepped into the breach and he said, he wrote a 2-page really think piece, and he crystallized an idea, and it's just taken off over the last 20 years. But basically what he was trying to explain was, why do we allow things to incrementally basically degrade? And it's, you know, because the world we know is the world we see right now. So James, you know, how long ago did you come to Vancouver?
10 years.
10 years. So the world, so your perception of Vancouver was as it was 10 years ago. And Steve, you know, how long have you been here?
23.
23, see? So again, you changed it. It's changed a bit, right? But you've seen the changes to, you know, over from year 23 to year 10. And so that's why we allow things to happen. What I found particularly good about this graphic is that people start relating to their own circumstances in terms of maybe the neighborhood they lived in. That was his whole point. You know, he was coming at this from a tertiary perspective. But he said, it can be whatever some good thing is. You just kind of think about it. So it's not about being, you know, a curmudgeon complaining about the way things used to be. It's having that appreciation from the past. And so I first glommed onto this 2 years ago for the purposes of a cross-Canada workshop series. And I needed something at that point to be able to relate to the other provinces, you know, why we thought differently in British Columbia, because we do think differently. And I, you know, initially I thought, okay, this is a way of explaining we're just on different points on a curve. And it was my conversation with a fellow named Gilles Rivard in Quebec, who would be my equivalent there in terms of, you know, the role he's played historically in terms of rainwater management, stormwater management, all that kind of stuff. And we're having lunch, and I said to him, Gilles, so how do Quebecers, how do you think about your, you know, the tributary streams and from, you know, and the fisheries? And he looked at me blankly. He said, well, we have the St. Lawrence River. So he'd lost any kind of sense of appreciation for the significance of tributary streams. And that made me think, because growing up in the Lower Mainland as I did, you know, a generation or two ahead of me, everybody has these vivid memories of the 50s when all the streams on the North Shore, whether it's my North Shore, which is West End, North Vancouver, or your North Shore, Port Moody, etc., all those streams were teeming with salmon. So we have a memory that goes back to our grandparents and their parents. Whereas in Quebec, as an example, you know, they had 500 years to alter the landscape, so they have no recollection. And so that's when I began to realize this was probably a very significant graphic, because in terms of the big idea, which is, that's not just, you know, declining, we can actually reset it. That's the essence of what we're saying when we use the expression sustainable watershed system, that we can reset it if we implement standards of practice, bring it back to what we do as engineers that can restore a desired condition. But it's going to take time, commitment, and perseverance. It doesn't happen overnight. But it's the big idea to take away, because it does start to influence your thinking. And that's why, you know, coming back to the title of this presentation, Sustainable Watershed System, because we made that, you know, we decided last November when we released the Outline Guide for 2015 to begin the branding of this. And actually, I would say that we're ahead of schedule in kind of the uptake. I mean, I've had so many opportunities to talk and present this theme, including today. So, you know, if you get the language right, people will buy in, and that's the first step to creating those long-term changes. So in terms of, you know, my career, you know, it's taken more than a decade to implement a policy program and a regulatory framework in British Columbia that makes possible water resilient communities. So just kind of giving you this timeline, this mind map, which is, you know, what happens in the land matters, but in terms of how we move through time incrementally, 2003 was the teachable year. And I'm going to explain or show you some visuals very shortly to make that real to you, but keep that in mind, the teachable year. 2008 is the call to action. The reason we call that call to action, because Gordon Campbell, as Premier, did two things. He championed Living Water Smart, BC's water plan, which was released in June that year. and they champion green communities. And what a lot of people don't know is the Green Communities Initiative started as a post-it note on somebody's desk in the Ministry of Community Development. Turn this into an initiative. But that was the call to action, the high-level language that we need to get things done. But 2014, I call it the game changes that enable action, because 3 things happened in 2014. It started with the Water Sustainability Act. Hugely profound, hugely significant in terms of what it took to get to that point, but what it starts to set up for the long term. Developed with Care 2014 just doesn't get the profile, partly because the people who were the champions from it have retired from government, but it's very significant in terms of what it pulled together. But the real game changer, and all, that's really the essence of our sustainable watershed systems thinking, is asset management for sustainable service delivery, a framework for British Columbia. So although the date of release was December, it's effectively rolled out in 2015. The reason that is significant, because it's the driver. It's the financial driver for change in British Columbia. Because if you want the money ultimately, you'll start changing your behavior in order to get the money. That's what we are. But so in terms of introducing a new paradigm, and, when I first started presenting this thing, watersheds as infrastructure assets, you never know how audiences are going to react to the first time you say it. But what I found over the last year, I was in Australia end of August at a national conference presenting a keynote address, and it's amazing how when you explain it right and you say to people, especially in the engineering crowd, watershed is an infrastructure asset, and they go, I get it intuitively, because the next thing is to get them thinking as a system, right? A watershed is a system. It's an integrated system. And guess what? There are 3 pathways how water, or how rainfall reaches streams. Well, I would think of each one of those as an infrastructure asset. And guess what? Those pathways, each one of them provides a water balance service, because go back to asset management for sustainable service delivery, the emphasis is on the service, right? The asset management is the means to an end, which is sustainable service delivery. So that's kind of like, your conceptual background. In terms of how the rest of this hour will unfold, got it organized in 4 segments. The new normal in British Columbia, which of course is all using that expression, right? Water Balance 101, convening for action in British Columbia, which is really what the partnership does, and then a bit on sustainable watershed systems. So what I'm thinking, and I'll have to judge by the looks in your eyes. Maybe at the end of every one of these modules, I'll just kind of pause and see if somebody really wants to elaborate on something. I can see you, right? You nod your head over.
As a general gesture.
Good. So you'll be ready for what I say. And what do you think? And what do you think? Mo, okay. All right. So, Bob Sanford. Does everybody know of Bob Sanford? Who does not know of Bob Sanford? Okay. Well, actually, so half the crowd does know Bob Sanford. That's good. A lot of times you'll say, he's got all these books. People say, who's Bob? You know Bob, right? Anyway, but he gave me this quote last year, because when we think back to 2015, none of us who are long-term water guys, whatever, see anything like it, where we had this drought which started the U.S.-Mexican border all the way up to British Columbia and then east to Manitoba. It was just, unparalleled, and especially when it started. And so really what Bob said was that 2015 really suggested that we may be crossing this threshold. It's different. I've included this slide because sometimes it's important to kind of step back and provide a perspective. And this is a graphic I've used in presentations in the States and in Australia, just to kind of make the point that even though British Columbia is a really big province, we all live on this very tiny footprint, right? There's 3.5 million people, and the first time when I took this Google shot, and I had thought I better superimpose the American border, because otherwise it gives you the wrong impression that all the gray over here that's us, but you realize how little an area are when you talk about British Columbia, you say our backs are against the mountains, there's the U.S. border, there's the agricultural land reserve, and then there's the water. So it's defined it. So, but what I think it's done, especially when you compare British Columbia to other places, it's given us more of a sense of urgency that other places haven't had to actually be able to do things differently. So that's partly why we have a longer history of really doing things. So I'm kind of stating the obvious to this crowd, I'm sure, which is the climate is changing in terms of wetter, warmer winters, longer, drier summers. And then when you really think about what the numbers are telling us is that you know, the annual volumes aren't changing so much, but you're getting a different distribution. And you know, for me, it was a classic example where last November, in terms of as I went around to the various our various regional district partners, making the roll presentations to board to the regional boards on Beyond the Guidebook 2015, and it was the one in Communes where I was going to speak, and BC Hydro were giving their some sort of an update on the situation with Communes Lake. And forget his name now, that Stephen, you probably know him, BC Hydro's communications guy in the Communes Valley State. Anyway, but he you know, here we are, it's November, it's the end of the 2015 drought, and he was talking about the fact, yeah, obviously, things are being really bad in terms of the drought, but when you look at the 12 months of records, the previous fall was record rain, so on an annual basis, it looked okay, right? But we'd had a feast and famine. Now, as it turned out, a month later, or a couple weeks later, we were having our feast and famine workshop, and that was partly what we were trying to point was that it's the extreme. So on the average, everything looks okay, but not so, right? And again, it's such a great photograph from last year in terms of February or end of February and no snow. And and what really surprised me about last year was that the 2015 was voted by the public as the story of the year. And the reason that surprised me was because I didn't think that between the time that rain started to fall by September, October, that the general population would have remembered by December for the polling. So it was a bit of a surprise when I got the call from CBC asking to do a bunch of radio interviews and TV interviews that this was the story. So because my experience has been, the timeline is about 2 years. Within 2 years, people will be saying, what drought? And to remind you why I said 2003 was the teachable year, because we had everything that year in terms of drought, forest fires, floods, and pine beetle. And if it hadn't been for 2003 and all these things kind of happening, and people sort of saying, okay, Mother Nature's trying to tell us something, I probably wouldn't be here today. And the reason I say that is because that was the initial momentum for the Water Sustainability Action Plan. So by the time, timing is everything. So by February, when it was released and we had a basis for getting a program going, it all fed off the fact that we had a teachable year where things got the public attention. But kind of bringing it back to a local government perspective, what goes on in the local government world, the legacy of past community planning and infrastructure services practices is the natural water balance of watersheds is out of balance. It's the simplest way to express it because of the way we have historically developed planning. And after decades of appealing to people to do the right thing, the better thing, in terms of environmental values, whatever, at the end of the day, it does come back to financial. And so even the messaging I use has changed in the last few years because I find it a lot easier to go before councils and boards and say, that you can't afford to finance or replace your core infrastructure like water and sewer and roads. So why would you take on an unfunded liability called drainage where you have no source of funding 20 years down the road to fix up the problems you've created? So that's kind of the legacy that we're still dealing with, and that's the significance of moving us towards sustainable watershed systems. So in terms of another quotable quote to kind of round out this segment on the new normal, Joni Watson, who's part of the interregional team, said, through sharing and learning, ensure that where we are going is indeed the right way. And I think that applies to a lot of situations, because one of the things that I have found, whether it be going across Canada or in Australia, is that people will say, what are your criteria, right? What's the engineering criteria? What is it, parts per million? And you say, no, it's not about that. It's what's the goal, right? What are we trying to achieve? And to get there, you know, it's all about, it's a bottom-up approach. It's not somebody saying you've got to meet a certain number. Anybody want to ask me something? Or should I keep moving? Water balance 101, I've really found it's really important to kind of step back and kind of teach some basics, because one has to really be careful, because words mean different things to different people. And, you know, if you have a different definition, you can go like two ships passing in the lake. So really I just want to lead you through some basic thinking in terms of what, you know, from an engineering perspective, from a hydrology perspective, what you really should know. And maybe that's my next question for this group. I asked you where you're from. I asked you where you worked. Did I ask you how many people work with water on a daily basis? You? Who are the water folks in this group? So, okay, 20%. So the rest of you, what do you do? Are you structurals? Are you electricals? Or are you just curious? Who's going to volunteer? Oh, come on.
Well, I work on civil projects, water-related hydrology. Yeah.
Okay, good. I won't single you out anymore. Water balance 101. So again, thinking about how we think in British Columbia in a bit of a context, and compared to other places. As British Columbians, you all know that we do think differently than the rest of the world, right? Does anybody tell that we think differently? And I think it really does come back to the fact that the mountains do make us think differently. And a couple of years ago, I drove across North America with my son, and that's when I realized how flat North America is, and how boring the countryside is, and it makes one really realize why we think in terms of the tributaries and the tribes in British Columbia. And when you have a tributary thinking, you think differently than the people who are in a place where they just have these big river systems. We think differently. But we also have this very strong connection to the natural environment. And that's why, in case in point on the ferry yesterday, why if you're on the ferry, and if there's a whale sighting or a dolphin sighting, why, think about why the ferry will, they'll make an announcement and they'll slow down. They'll say, look out, on the port side. And especially in recent years, there's been more and more sightings. So this is important to British Columbians, those symbols, work. In fact, that's what people say to me. They'll say, British Columbians are lucky because you do have orcas and you do have salmon and you do have dolphins. You can use them as symbols, because other places just don't seem to have the same symbols, which you kind of get that emotional reaction from the general population. And a good indicator of that is, how many times have you been watching local news and they'll have pictures of whale sightings or dolphin sightings, right? Anyway, so we do have this stronger connection, and I think that's partly why we have a whole systems way of thinking. I am not saying that every person thinks in terms of the whole systems. I'm talking in terms of a professional philosophy or a culture. We tend to think differently. But the other provinces where urban drainage is the priority, they are definitely driven by things like water quality, no increase in flooding, and they tend to be influenced by the American Northeast. They tend to be influenced by the US EPA. Whereas, we're in that Washington, Oregon, BC kind of triumvirate where we a little bit out of sync with them. But usually it's because, we're probably more in tune with nature. So that's the kind of connection. And so, coming back to the significance of the primer, very thin document, we realized that there really was a need to kind of capture some of the learnings to remind the next generation, right? The things that I may take for granted, which were 15, 20 years ago, that people forget. People are changing jobs, they're moving on. What was common wisdom is being lost. And so we thought, okay, we need to capture the common understanding in a primer to help multiple audiences. And the mistake is when you write things too technical or too simple, right? So ask the right questions, ensure that the science-based understanding is applied properly and effectively to implement the practices that ultimately restore the hydrologic integrity of the oceans, right? Because we're talking about resetting the baseline which won't happen in 5 years, won't happen in 15 years. You've got to get the basics right. And to a large extent, we have not done the basics in engineering correctly in terms of hydrology and all that kind of stuff. So, because we haven't necessarily understood the science, and if we haven't understood the science, we haven't been applying the understanding correctly. So, in terms of the integrated approach, the whole systems approach, I mean, you've got to think about the sites, the people, the watershed, the stream, and the groundwater. All these things are working together there, but so often, and I just reflect on my own career, the words we used about groundwater would typically be motherhood words, and nobody took them seriously in terms of what we were trying to do and however we were framing language and government documents. So again, a soundbite for you to take away, which is mimic the water balance. Think basically here, right? Reducing risk, improving watershed health, complying with regulatory requirements. Like, if you want the grant, start doing it properly. And so in 2002, British Columbia adopted the water balance methodology. So I was the project manager and the principal author of Stormwater Planning, a guide that British Columbia released in 2002. And so basically, that was a transformational change in our history where we were applying the science. So why were we different from everybody else? Well, the first thing was to recognize that we're primarily a mountainous region, my earlier story. Headwater tributary streams are a predominant feature. Yes, we have the Fraser River, but this is not. We're not into river basin systems like in Alberta where they have the two big basins. And watershed health is very much about protection of aquatic habitat. So that's a fundamentally different driver than in an environment like the Montreal region, which has been urbanized or developed for 500 years and very much is about water quality and flooding and whatever. So in terms of aquatic habitat, the critical issue is being habitat damage and loss caused by land development and erosion of streams. So that's the context of why British Columbia adopted the water balance methodology. So really, in terms of what changed things, and it was really only when making this keynote address in Australia where I began to understand the debate going on in Australia about how to approach things, and realized that what was so critical for us in British Columbia was the work of Horner and May 20 years ago coming out of Washington State. And what I realized 2 months ago in Australia was they allowed us to change the conversation in British Columbia. Whereas if I look at Australia today, and they're, yes, they're trying to move in the same direction as us, and they're talking about the same things, but they're bogged down in engineers arguing with engineers about formulas. And which formula should we use? And I thought, no. The key with Rich and with Chris is that they apply a whole systems approach in terms of the Puget Sound research, correlated land use, and the consequences for stream pump. That's the significance. And Rich's sounds like being get the hydrology right, and water quality typically follows along. So bold idea number 2, which is primacy of hydrology. And it's funny that even expressing the primacy of hydrology, I've had conversations with Rich Horner over the last couple of years. Before I went on the cross-country tour, I wanted to sort of see how he was thinking 20 years later. And you know how it is when you have the conversations with people, that's when you get the ahas. And I said to Rich, because people are starting to forget the significance of your work. And how did you look at it 20 years later? And then as we were talking, he said, well, my wife follows all these medical studies. And he said, have you ever noticed how every 20 years, a study will come out and sort of say, what was commonly believed for 20 years in the world of medicine has just been debunked, right? And Rich said, you're right, we got it right because he said, we thought in terms of a systems approach. We thought of the whole system. We didn't kind of pick one parameter. We looked at everything. And that was the key. So whole systems, primacy of hydrology, getting it right. So, this is a building blocks process. And so in terms of, my past 15, 20 years, yes, linking to rainfall, the landscape, stream flow, groundwater, sustainable surgery, it's been a building blocks process as we take these ideas and we evolved them by having to be connected off. So yes, in 2002, we were so bold in terms of the guidebook to say we can reduce runoff volume. Where we are in 2015, we're saying, okay, we're now in a position where we can view water balance pathways as infrastructure assets for providing services because we have enough understanding of application of the science to be able to have numbers for design. That's what it really comes down to. So science-based understanding becomes clearer over time, because 20 years ago, Horner and May had a breakthrough in terms of the raw research, and 20 years later, we can begin to see how we can, over decades now, achieve a vision for sustainable watershed systems. But I tell you, in 2002, in the year 2000 rather, we faced a lot of fear and doubt in British Columbia. When I say we, you know, those on the team. Because people in local government said, we can't do anything, right? Because everybody thought traditionally, everybody thought in terms of the 100-year storm, but we can never manage that. And what turned things around was putting things into very simple understanding in terms of, well, let's look at the rainfall days in a year. So this, anything began to address fear and doubt, we can actually turn things around over time. It was the simple relationship by saying, you know what, if it rains 190 days in a year, 160 of them, it's not a big deal, right? And we only have a handful to really worry about. And guess what? You know, the bulk of the volume is in those frequent storms. That was transformational because it demonstrated the achievability of what we could do at the site level. So that's kind of the historical context, the very first building block. So I'm going to just kind of, and actually that was your, if I go backwards, that's your first guiding principle. I'm going to go through a series of guiding principles here. So the first guiding principle is manage all the rainfall days in the year. It's the system. Watershed protection starts with an understanding of how water gets to a stream and how long it takes. And you know, so much of what we've historically done is focused on the surface runoff, but that's just one pathway. The interflow is the key. So the interflow, that's the horizontal flow, that's from days to seasons, and then there's the deep groundwater, which takes years to ground, decades or more for it to move. And people think of groundwater as a lake, but it's not just a lake, the water's dynamic, it's moving. So guiding principle number 2, maintain the proportion of rainwater entering the system by each pathway. Maintain the proportion of rainwater entering the stream by each pathway. Because in a local, in the built environment, you have control over that through your practices. What does the water balance in a typical West Coast watershed look like? Well, guiding principle number 3, understand where the water goes naturally and reproduce those conditions. So this reflows from the previous one. So here's a typical set of numbers, right? So when you're looking at stream flow, 80%. How does that 80% get there through the 3 pathways? Direct runoff, 10%. Groundwater from aquifers, 15%. Because think about what is typically British Columbia. I mean, we have either glacial till or rock. Right? So not a lot of groundwater other than the Fraser Valley and a few other valleys. Interflow, that flow that moves horizontally through the sponge, right? 55%. That is the pathway that we have historically eliminated. So, effectively doubling the amount of volume of water you have to handle if you're a local government responsible for systems. So, guiding principle number 4, restore interflow to maintain hydrologic integrity. So again, hopefully those numbers seem that way, you kind of get the sense of why we say interflow is so important. Yet it's something we, it seems like we're bringing back the word interflow again. 15, 20 years ago, we emphasized the word interflow, people were getting it, and there's a memory problem. We tend to forget things. I think we have to kind of remind people every 5 to 10 years about the basics.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Can you help me differentiate the interflow from the surface runoff? Initially I was thinking it's from a tributary to a river or a stream, but there's something else going on here I missed.
Yeah. The surface runoff, just land that's running across the ground surface. As simple as that. Yeah, where there's, interflow is below the ground surface. It's in that top 1 to 3 feet. Yeah. That's what we always forget. So, where this is all going from an engineering point of view, it's all about energy. Because if you have more volume of water in a creek, it's the erosion. Erosion is energy. So that's what's creating the issue. So if you're going to truly mimic nature, then you've really got to match flow duration. So that the receiving stream is seeing each flow rate for the same period of time as it's always seen it, because if it's seeing a flow rate for more time, then it's starting to erode. So guiding principle number 5, replicate the flow duration pattern to mimic the water balance. This slide kind of brings the water balance 101 netting, because again, for an audience which, as we've seen, it's a diverse audience. How do we bring it down to something practical? Well, the one thing that everybody can do, whether it's every community, every local government can do, is you can start with your rain garden program. And North Vancouver City is doing it, Delta's doing it, Langley Township is doing it. It starts with a rain garden. And so if you want to bring the high fluting language down to what can designers do, it really does come back to a design detail. It's typical engineering cross-section. 3 numbers, right? A volume for storage, a release rate into your manhole, your outlet control manhole to sustain the interflow that the creek sees, and an area to allow for recharge. It's 3 numbers. It's a standard detail. It's an easy way to think, but you need not just 1 or 2. You do need hundreds or thousands of rain gardens. But it's a manageable strategy. Ready for the next module? All right. Convene for action in BC. That's our mantra. Talk is cheap. So when I say convening for action, what I'm really saying to each one of you is, when you leave this room today, what will you do? Don't tell me the answer, but that's the challenge, right? Because it's easy to come to a session like this, hear a rah-rah speech, or learn some neat stuff. But what will you do differently, Mo, when you leave here, right? As a civil designer, right? And that's where we be acquainted. And the reason we actually coined that convening for action as a mantra, going back almost 15 years ago, because it was about 98, 99, around that time, where there was, I guess, one of the first, I guess they call them the State of Sea series now, right? Where Eric Carlson, and he spent a lot of time organizing this, one of these cross-border Washington State, and British Columbia, and you bring people together in the big event, and then they're all going to do great stuff, and nothing happens. I think that's when we learned, you've got to convene for action. You just don't convene just to pontificate. And so part of convening for action then is it's what happens on a daily basis. So in terms of the Partnership for Water Sustainability, and my role, and what we're trying to do, the mission being developing tools, developing talent, focusing on outcomes. It's very much, in a way, I'm here as a cheerleader, right? Saying people are doing good work in British Columbia. You need to know they're doing good work, and it's because people have been doing good work for the last 15, 20 years that there's reason to be hopeful about the future. And so, if you are keen to be kept informed, just think of waterbucket.ca, and if you send an email to waterbucket.ca, you can get our weekly e-blast. But I really want to just focus on the Georgia Basin Interregional Education Initiative for the next few minutes. It looks like I'm doing well for time. Okay. So, one of the things we realized is that, and it's really why British Columbia is so different from other jurisdictions, because we do have this philosophy about the need to agree on expectations and how everybody will work together, and and say that after that each community can kind of get to the goals in its own way as opposed to a top-down prescriptive rule. So if people outside British Columbia cannot understand this way of thinking. It's alien to them. So under the action plan umbrella, we've been promoting what we call the regional team approach. It's partnerships, it's collaboration in a world where more and more is expected at the local level, and people are stretched tighter and tighter, and more, it's not do more with less, it's do more with the same. And really it's, by pooling resources, you can get a lot more done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but it's also aligning actions at 3 scales, the provincial, the regional, and local. But people need to be informed and they need to be educated about what it is the goals are, right? So this is the BC process for moving from awareness to action. So it's the what, so what, now what, then what. And so unlike what I've been asked that question in other places, what's your formula, what's your criteria? Well, we're saying, well, what is the issue? Well, our issue is that the form of land development in the urban environment, well, it impacts on how water is used, yes, and how water runs off the land, and how water reaches streams. That's what we're dealing with. So it's not a formula. It's not a prescriptive thing. It's not a criterion. So you've got to understand what the issue is, and then in terms of so what can be done. Well, we've got to influence practitioners to design with nature, which means they have to understand how the system works, so they can actually design accordingly. And now what can we do? Because typically, most engineers' careers have been defined by the challenge of how do we get from what to so what, because every decade has a flood and a drought. So every decade we historically do a report, which would then go on the shelf until the next flood or drought and updated, right? So that's the hydrological cycle. So anyway, so in terms of moving beyond that barrier to now what can we do, it is about embracing shared responsibility and learning by doing. So it's the learning by doing and the sharing of precedents. That's what it's all about. And then what? Well, you replicate, right? So somebody has to lead the way. So building resiliency then, it's the regional team approach. It's embracing shared responsibility. Mission impossible. It's everybody is involved. And these are not just words. This is where people are making progress is because the players are there. Whether the province, the government, developers, First Nations, stewardship sector, agricultural sector, academia. We'll give you lots of examples, and that's the essence of the Georgia Basin Interregional Education Initiative. So that's what we're responsible for delivering. So launched in 2012, 5 regional districts: Metro, Capital, Cowichan, Nanaimo, Comox Valley. It represents 75% of BC's population. Multiple times to go back to the boards, ask them to pass those resolutions, because those resolutions translate into staff action, right? Staff commitments. So 2016, this last round, asking them to recommit to work through 2021 to work as a team, because nobody is able to do everything, but everybody can do something. And these 10 rules, this is the essence of our experience on the ground in British Columbia, on the east coast of Vancouver Island, in the Lower Mainland, when people are successful in local government. And it starts off by choosing to be enabled. Because in British Columbia, our approach to government is characterized that it's not prescriptive. You are enabled to do it. It's like Nike, choose to do it. And establishing high expectations, embracing a shared vision, collaboration, aligning and integrating efforts, celebrating innovation. So more than a decade ago, we had our own aha when we said, one of the things that we were going to be doing at that time was to create a model bylaw for British Columbia with supporting standards. And we had an aha mode when we convened the regional engineers in the Metro Vancouver region, when we actually had them got them talking, and they all began to realize each of them was doing stuff nobody knew about. And coming out of that was a total change in direction, which was we need to celebrate when people are doing good work, And we won't worry about the laggards, because the laggards will just catch up. But we've got to promote the champions. And we also have seen power of local government decision makers collaborating with community advocates. In particular, what we're seeing now is this need, as you've seen the demographic change of people retiring, of even more emphasis and need now to actually be developing the next generation of talent, which means passing on the wisdom. And the big thing is shared responsibility, which is, you know, you can't be putting and looking to somebody else to do it, you need to do it. And last point being, it's all about changing the land ethic.
Can you define land ethic a little bit for meat and bones there?
I think it's just a very simple definition, which is, do you respect nature, or are you trying to conquer nature? Because that's really what it comes down to. And I think it goes back to when Ian McCarg, you know, who actually coined design with nature, and when he wrote his book in '68. I think that was kind of a watershed moment in terms of saying, are you designing with nature or are you conquering nature? Because how you treat the land is what is your ethic, and that's what kind of ripples through everything that follows. Is that good enough?
Yeah, sure.
So, again, I'm constantly speaking through a local government lens, and so the local governments learn from each other, and they progress through sharing a case study experience. You wouldn't believe, for those of you who are in local government, those put your hands up, right? You're used to talking to your colleagues in other places, right? How'd you do that, right? So it's a very powerful way of learning. So it is important to tell those stories, because that's the only way we can eliminate the disconnect between information and implementation. That's the challenge, the disconnect between information and implementation. We know what we should do, it's just doing it. So that's why the water bucket is such a key resource to get the stories up there. And this is what needs to happen to achieve integration that leads to action. I got to tell you the story behind this graphic here, because it was my colleague Bill Gary 20 years ago, and he was driving from Seattle to Vancouver, and he literally scribbled that as he was driving, because he had all that time to think. And by the time he arrived in City Surrey for a workshop, he presented this, and we put it into the guidebook, because what it showed was everything starts with education in order to get to action and implementation. And you can follow that route multiple ways, right? Because you look at the words, you know, from education to understanding, or is it education to participation? Whichever way you go, ultimately, you know, it starts with education. And I know people always find it hard to believe when an engineer says it starts with education, because we kind of get labeled, don't we? But, you know, it does take commitment, right? And it does take champions, because we've always been able to look at particular local governments that are saying, is there a champion? And so part of the Convening for Action initiative is to connect up with champions, because it can be awfully lonely being a champion. Where do you work?
The airport.
The airport, right, that's right. Yeah. Just trying to remember, yeah. And getting the job done. So inform, educate, inspire. I hope a few of you are getting inspired. So where this all starts to come together in terms of you know, what happens on the land and the game changers, just to reinforce what I've said several times, which is that asset management for sustainable service delivery framework for BC, that's the linchpin. That's the linchpin, because it is, and the rate at which behavior is changing in British Columbia within the rules of local government is faster than anybody anticipated. Because it was only, as I said, it was December of 2014 when it was released, and again, it was a collaborative thing between province, Union BC municipalities, and Asset Management BC, and a whole bunch of professional associations and groups, whatever it was. So it was a consensus document. And so considering it's only been not even 2 years, how it's changing the culture and how it's motivating people within local government to approach asset management differently, and how other provinces and other countries are now starting to look at British Columbia in terms of this framework. So, but it's the financial incentive. That's what drives behavior. Because right now, whether it's the gas tax grants, or right now the Clean Water and Wastewater Fund, ultimately it comes back to how are you doing in terms of implementing this change of thinking. And it's not a prescriptive thing, it's everything I've been describing. Sustainable watershed systems, the last 5 minutes or so. So we are moving from asset management to sustainable service delivery. I mean, that's the philosophy governing so much of what we're doing. And I think this quote from Wes Shoemaker kind of captures it in terms of moving beyond traditional engineering infrastructure, asset management, to also account for nature services. You know, we are in a transition period. First of all, we're having to catch up, right? Because we're having to actually implement asset management, and we're having to now position for the next evolution, all in the same breath. But again, it's not being mandated or prescribed that you got to get to the ultimate vision. It's a progressive thing. But this is the corporate philosophy. This is the culture. So just to remind you of a key takeaway, a watershed is an infrastructure asset. It provides services. We're talking about sustainable service delivery. So give you a chance to absorb that. BC, we have a provincial framework, policy, program, regulatory, that enables governments to move from understanding to implementation with a whole systems approach, right? It's key to the primacy of hydrology. So remember that we can restore the hold idea number 1, we can restore the baseline, hold idea number 2, primacy of hydrology. What this graphic is intended to capture really is a reflection of my career in the last 14 years, because in 2002, we had a breakthrough. Our breakthrough from bridging the gap between a policy framework and what's happening on the ground was having science-based understanding of what was going on the ground. And we bridged that gap at that level. 14 years later, what we're trying to do now is bridge that gap between understanding and implementation. So we moved from understanding what the nature of changes in hydrology to having methodologies and tools, and actually it gets tougher, right? Because in retrospect, 2002 was the easy part because we bridged the gap in understanding at a high level. It gets tougher and tougher as you drill further and further down to on the ground, right below where you're designing things on a daily basis. But that kind of captures our evolution in British Columbia over the last 14 years. Judge progress by how far we've come. We've got a long ways to go, and it's going to take a long educational process. So in terms of the local government lens, quote from David Allen, who's the CAO in Courtenay, the role of local government is to deliver services. Maybe that sounds obvious to you, but that's something that's had to be really hammered home lately about, which is not about the assets, it's about the services. Because as soon as you start providing services, it allows you to talk about levels of service and expectations. That's the end goal of asset management. The asset management continuum. So this is the branding graphic for asset management for the BC framework. What we've coupled that with is this aspect of the continuum, which says, okay, when you're at ground zero, there is no plan. You haven't dealt with asset management. You haven't begun to plan things yet. So right now you have this unfunded liability. What is it in Canada? How many hundreds of billions of dollars? So step 1 is you embrace the BC framework. You focus on your core assets, water, sewage, roads. You embark on an asset management strategy. By step 2, as it's coming together, you're going to be thinking holistically. You're going to implement a life cycle approach, because never has there been such emphasis in the last few years about the 80-20 rule, which is, as you know from Prince George probably, or any municipality, of a life cycle cost of any asset, 20% is the capital, right? 80% is the long-term maintenance. So that's the deficit, the 80-20 deficit. To step 3, which is, once you have all your core infrastructure under control, then you're in a position to tackle drainage. We really use a very grounded word, and begin to actually integrate the natural systems thinking and utilizing nature's services. But you're not going to wait until for step 3 because your thinking should be changing all the way through here, but logistically, you've got to get the other stuff sorted out first. And so the faster you're coming up to speed in terms of asset management and sustainable service delivery, both governments will be that much better positioned to move into sustainable watershed systems through asset management. So just kind of to give you a few visuals, again, bringing it down to something practical, which is North Vancouver's rain garden program, and what Darryl Masato said about a single rain garden will not make a material difference, but thousands of them would. So again, it's this whole idea of commitment, long-term commitment by staff, by changing councils and the community, and recognizing it takes time. And so these are some images from North Vancouver in terms of if you're going to design rain gardens, at least design them to work hydrologically properly. Another municipality which is committed to a rain garden program, and I just want to use this quotable quote from Hugh Fraser, who's a champion for the rain garden program, saying, "Everyone has to understand their role in the process," right? And he says, starts with students, designers, managers, and contractors. And what Hugh also says, it just requires constant reminders to people. What's the goal, right? So that their public works crew who builds the rain gardens in Delta, they know what the goal is. The goal is ultimately to protect the fisheries reserves. And again, a unifying theme today, what happens on the land matters. So words to leave you in terms of cascading objectives. So if we start with the high-level word of watershed health, and then resilient rainwater management down to sustainable service delivery, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to protect and restore hydrologic integrity. We do that by mimicking the natural water balance. Mimicking water balance means integrating natural systems thinking into our asset management. If we do all this, we are going to create the legacy. So it does come down to informing or influencing the form and function of the built environment, which is what you're trying to do with the program you're initiating at Port Moody. And if one of the advantages of a region like we have, where to accommodate a growing population through redevelopment, well, the redevelopment actually creates the opportunity to get it right the second time. So we're not sprawling, right? So we can redo things. It's got to take time, commitment, perseverance. I'm going to leave with this third bold idea. Cathedral thinking aptly describes the vision for sustainable watershed systems. Why does it do that? Well, we can learn from our ancestors. And what are you already all thinking about when I say cathedral thinking? I mean, I've given you the image. All those cathedrals which were built in the 1300s, 1400s. Those people who built them, right? They had to think in terms of multiple generations. Think about it. When a cathedral took 100 to 200 years to build, when you started it, you knew you would never see the ending, right? So successive generations knew they would never see the finished product. But they committed to it because there was a vision, there was a well thought out blueprint, and there was a shared commitment to long-term implementation. So that's really what we're saying. It's kind of ironic, kind of thinking back of to our what we heard at lunchtime about the 8-second attention factor, right? So at the same time, we're talking about people having kids having an attention span of 8 seconds to say, yeah, but if you really want to change the world, it's multiple generations. Right? So there's a message there. That's it. And we do have 15 minutes left.
Can I ask you a question?